All right. Excellent. Thanks so much for being here, everyone. It's great to see you. Huge thanks to Tim for doing this event. We've been doing a number of events in this cybersecurity speaker series. I think this is our last one for the academic year, and I was delighted when we were thinking about who to get involved that Tim was able to say yes and come and do this with us. Tim's a former national security and intelligence official, cybersecurity expert, privacy lawyer, and civil liberties activist. He teaches at Brown University and has taught here at HLS for a number of years as well, and reminded me that he gave a talk at Berkman many years ago when we were located in a little yellow house across the way here that some of you have surely been to over the years. Tim launched and now continues to help run the professional cybersecurity degree program at Brown, where he's a professor of the practice of computer science and a senior fellow at the Watson Institute for International Public Affairs. And we're going to get a preview today of a new book that he's working on, first bit of a new book that he's working on. I'm going to bow out, turn it over to Tim, and then maybe do a little bit of mic running and help to field questions at the end. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, Tim.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. And thanks to the Berkman Klein Center for the invitation. Really a terrific topic. You know, I threw together a kind of legal sounding title for what is really more a talk about my book on the history of cybersecurity, interception, really more on interception in the United States. The book is called Intercepted, American Surveillance from the Founders to the Deep State. And it tells 6 or 7, that's a little debate between me and my editor, stories about interception. And we'll hear one of those stories today. So I was thinking in terms of the legal implications of the story that I set in that history sets in the founding. And of course, part of the reason that we here at the law school are so interested in the American Revolution, in the founding fathers, is not so much founder chic, which is something that has been going on in the book world for many years, but because of originalism. One of my students said, "Wait a second, professor, you're not an originalist, are you?" And I had to say, well, no, not really, except in the sense that Elena Kagan said, you know, we're all originalists these days for 2 reasons. One is that no matter what our view of constitutional interpretation is, none of us could possibly disagree that the text of the Constitution and what the founders meant by that text isn't important in understanding the Constitution, but also because we've got 6 or 7 or 8 justices, or maybe all 9, that are using one or another form of originalism to understand and interpret our constitutional rights. So with that in mind, I want to tell a story that really hasn't been told much about the founders, cybersecurity, and how it relates to surveillance today. I was told this would work. There we go. Okay, so one of my key characters is Ben Franklin, from the title. And I want to give you his philosophy here. He was a printer, fundamentally. That's how he was buried. We know him as many things, as diplomat, as one of the drafters of the Declaration of Independence, together with Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, as the negotiator for the treaty that resulted in independence for the United States in 1783, and as the man who presided over the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. But he always considers his identity as one of being a printer. And in 1731, so this is when he was still pretty young, pretty early, he wrote this Apology for Printers, one of his famous essays, when he was accused of printing something too controversial, something that would offend the powers that be. And he had this statement: "Printers are educated in the belief that when men differ in opinion, both sides ought equally to have the advantage of being heard by the public, and that when truth and error have fair play, the former is always an overmatch for the latter. Hence they cheerfully serve all contending writers that pay them well, without regarding on which side they are of the question in dispute." Here we see a whole bunch of things about Franklin's character. First, we see a tremendous faith in the Enlightenment and in rational debate, something that we might have struggled with today in the 21st century. Is it true that truth is always an overmatch for error? we see the marketplace of ideas, both in terms of being a metaphor, truth and error fighting it out, as well as being quite literal. He's saying, look, this is part of our profession. This is what we shouldn't be. And we also see this idea of neutrality, that the printer provides what we might think of as infrastructure for democracy and for debate. The printer is not, it's a platform. We're familiar with the concept of digital platforms. And we also see some of his pragmatism. We might even say he's being a bit greedy here, right? This is very much in his self-interest to say that printers are neutral, that freedom of speech is a great ideal. Why? Because he wants to print whatever anyone wants to pay him. In other words, for Franklin, it was all about the Benjamins, we might say. So we see a lot of things in here that still resonate with us today in the 21st century. Another thing that Franklin brings to the table here, besides being a printer and an advocate for democratic debate, is being a postmaster. This 1754 wood print, very familiar to us, the snake chopped up into pieces. This is long, long before the Revolution. This is when people in the colonies are still feeling very, very British. We don't have the crisis that will come in the next decade in 1763. But already Franklin is thinking about these disparate colonies who pretty much have a relationship with London rather than with each other as being colonies that have to unite together. And union is going to take the form for Franklin in many ways of an information network, which is the postal system. In 1737, so just 6 years after that essay we just saw, Franklin is appointed the postmaster in Philadelphia. He displaces his rival in doing so. This is a key moment where Franklin, in his journey to great wealth and fame and fortune, understands that being a printer is a lot more lucrative when you also control the distribution network. Printers were often postmasters in the cities and towns where they operated. It gave them a tremendous advantage over any potential rivals who might want to come and displace them. They were now at the center of where all the information came. The letters, the other newspapers, the other publications were going to come to their shop where they had set up as postmaster. He does that in 1737. After lobbying and spending actually £300, that's a lot of money in London, spreading it around, he's able to get appointed deputy postmaster for the colony, one of two actually, and becomes in charge of the whole postal system for British North America. His co-deputy postmaster was far less active. Franklin is really the more important of the two. And then, of course, we see in 1763, which was an important date we'll come to in a second, Franklin goes on this grueling 1,780-mile tour of the postal system from Virginia to New Hampshire. It takes him many, many months. Again, helping to unite the colonies together, give them a sense of identity that's separate from their identity as colonies of Great Britain, but also making enormous improvements in the postal system along the way. We don't usually think of the postal system as a kind of technology because it seems like snail mail to us. But to them, we see these marvelous letters that say things like, my goodness, the world has become a small place. You know, it is possible to receive a letter from New York in Boston in less than a day. Or, in just a few months, we can find out what's going on in London. Kind of the same marveling that we would see over the internet in the 1990s. We also see some reforms that involve privacy and confidentiality. This oath is required by law. It's not something invented by Franklin. The Act of the 9th of Queen Anne, passed in 1911, which organized the British postal system. But Franklin was the first to really put it into practice and make all of his postal riders and employees swear it. I will not wittingly, willingly, or knowingly open or cause or procure or suffer to be opened any letter which shall come into my hands by reason of employment in the post office, except, and we'll get to this in a second too, by express warrant in writing under the hand of one of the principal secretaries of state for that purpose. This is the law that he inherits from Britain. He puts it into practice. He also makes practical reforms like the bags for mail should be sealed. They shouldn't be dumped out into the tavern, as it was often done, and people just peruse through them. No, they should be behind the desk. You should come up. If you don't know who this person is, you need some sort of indication, some letter or something that authenticates them before you give them the letter. At least these are the things that he's trying to get the post office to do during this period. Of course, we get some stirrings of conflict between the British and the Americans at this time. In the early 1760s, we get some debate later on about exactly when it starts. But of course, one of the key moments here is the oration against the writs of assistance by James Otis in 1761, when George III comes to the throne. And writs of assistance are essentially general warrants that allow officials to search without suspicion in order to enforce customs laws. We get this very, very long oration by James Otis, in which we have this wonderful quote about a man's house is his castle, and whilst he is quiet, he is as well guarded as a prince in his castle. This painting here is in the Massachusetts State House. You can go see the original, and it comes into our lore. In the audience during this oration, we have a young lawyer named John Adams, who remembers this very, very well as the beginning of what we historians will call the colonial or the imperial crisis, occurring from about 1760-ish, 1, 2, 3, up until 1776. So we're talking about basically a decade and a half or so of increasing debates and increasing unrest in the colonies regarding the relationship with Great Britain. And individual liberties and rights are a big part of that. And this particular right of against the writs of assistance is a part of that when it comes to privacy and search and seizure, and becomes the basis for our Fourth Amendment. But I want to leave off the Fourth Amendment for a minute here, because I feel like it gets a lot of play in these debates, and we don't get enough about the Postal Service, so I want to get back to that. Here we have Sam Adams, brewer and patriot, as we all know, but I'm going to talk about him being a patriot, and the committees of correspondence that spring up at this time. These are really multiple networks that are called this. There are transatlantic, local, and intercolonial networks of information, people writing letters to each other to inform each other about the great events that are unfolding. What legislation is Parliament considering? The Stamp Act creates massive unrest. Oh, but the Stamp Act may be repealed. So people want to have information. They want to have, these are essentially a form of intelligence that the different colonies have to communicate with one another in between the time when their assemblies are not in session. A committee of correspondence is appointed in order to continue to exchange information. And of course, Sam Adams is the spider sitting at the web here, weaving webs, radical webs. The Sons of Liberty are behind a great deal of this. And so we have a lot going on here. Letter writing is a social, a political, and it's a revolutionary act. We see, letters that say things like, "We commend that you have stood firm against what the British are doing." That particular letter would in itself be an act. Maybe it seems like, oh, this is a way that the Americans start to gain their identity as Americans. They start to think of themselves as one people, the people in Massachusetts and the people in Virginia and the people in New York, being united through these committees and through these networks, all of which, of course, are being carried on the postal network that Ben Franklin has reformed and made so effective, and which has guarantees of confidentiality built into the network. By 1773 to 74, really, we start to see these networks uniting together into a sort of inter-network, the original name of the internet, a continental network of networks, the committees of correspondence. And these are the committees. One thing that really struck me as I was researching and understanding this book is the concept of revolution. How legally, as a lawyer, how specifically do you go from here's the system that we have to here's a government system that will replace it? The answer here is the committees of correspondence. They become what will become eventually committees of safety, which are military committees, eventually becoming called provincial congresses, which replace and displace the old colonial governments. The provincial congresses then are the direct descendants of the state governments that we have today. So that's really what's happening here in this period, a nascent prototype of state governments that will take over after the Declaration of Independence in 1776. So what about the post office? Here we have William Goddard, a printer and postmaster, began in Providence, Rhode Island, went on to Baltimore, Maryland. At this time, Ben Franklin is often in London again. He spends a lot of his time in London, actually, unique among the founding fathers, representing colonial establishments, still collecting money as the deputy postmaster, engaged in real estate speculation, which we'll get into a little bit in the book. And William Goddard comes along and he has a beef with the postal system. In 1774, he proposes an alternative to the official post office. These are sometimes called Goddard's post offices, but more interestingly from our perspective, they're called the constitutional post. William Goddard proposes a constitutional post as a replacement for what he calls the parliamentary post, which is really the king's post. This was the time when revolutionaries were sort of pretending that the king didn't really know what Parliament was doing, and it was really the Parliament that was the problem. And the key here is that Goddard says the king's post, the parliamentary post, is a tax. It's taxation without consent, because the cost of postage is much higher than the cost of running the service. It's creating a profit. Now, this was an issue for Ben Franklin, where his Benjamins kind of got in the way of his principles. He was against the Stamp Act. He was against the other kinds of acts. He was not against the post office that was paying him. And he argued, no, this is different. This is a service. So there's kind of a dispute going on here. Goddard is trying to get the committees of correspondence and other like-minded printers to stop using the official post and instead to use his post at this time in 1774. His biggest obstacle in doing all of this is everyone still likes Ben Franklin a lot. And so they kind of feel, yeah, you're making some good points about the taxation without representation. You're making some interesting ideas here about whether we should really be trusting our letters to this official network that might be surveilled, but we're not so sure. But along comes the perfect opportunity for the Constitutional Post in the downfall of Ben Franklin in January of 1774. A little known event, which is actually massively important to Franklin and to the whole lead up to the Revolution, is something called the Hutchinson Letters Affair. This is Ben Franklin in front of the Privy Council in January of 1774, and he is virtually on trial because of this scandal. The letters of Thomas Hutchinson, who's the governor of Massachusetts, have been leaked and printed in Boston. They then cross the Atlantic. They're printed in London. There's even a duel fought over who was the leaker that takes place in December of 1773, until Franklin comes along in Christmas Day of 1773 and says, I am the leaker, so that there wouldn't be another duel, basically, to make sure that there's no bloodshed. He had been given these letters. We still don't know by whom. I was hoping that I might be able to figure this out, but it turns out that it's hard to solve mysteries after 250 or more years. But there's some pretty good candidates. Those letters contain phrases from Thomas Hutchinson, like, there must be an abridgment of what are called English liberties. So they're dynamite, in other words. They're printed in Boston. Hutchinson is burned in effigy. He's the villain. This is all part of Franklin's plan to make Hutchinson a scapegoat. He hopes to go to the ministry and say, get rid of Hutchinson, put in somebody more reasonable, and you'll stitch this whole thing up. And everyone will be happy. Franklin will rise up in the British Empire. The whole dispute will be healed, and we won't have to go and fight some kind of battle. That's, of course, not how it worked out. And part of the reason it didn't work out there is instead of saying thank you for this brilliant information operation, they attacked Franklin, as naturally, the leaker, someone who had been sworn to uphold the secrecy of letters has now betrayed that secrecy. Alexander Wedderburn gives this the position of Hutchinson in this hearing, and he just goes after Franklin. Men will watch him with a jealous eye. They will hide their papers from him and lock up their escritoires. I guess that means desks. He will henceforth esteem it a libel to be called a man of letters. Homo trium literarum. The trium is important here. This is a joke. You should all laugh when I say homo trium. Aha, we can all laugh, right? You know Latin, right? It means the man of three letters. The three letters are F-U-R, and that means fur, and that means thief. Thief. So he's calling him a thief. Franklin never gets over this. This is a massive humiliation for him, and it's what drives him into the arms of the Patriots. Again, very late. This is January of 1774. It's not clear what side Franklin will end up on in the Revolution. And instead, he ends up on our side, on the Patriot side. And a lot of it is because of continued hard feelings from this hearing. Of course, Wedderburn's making some good points there, right? He's the deputy postmaster. He took confidential letters. He exposed them to the mob. Maybe there's a point to be made here about what Franklin did. But that's not how it's remembered today. What's remembered is that Franklin was abused with a horrible attack, and despite what he was trying to do to save the empire. Back across the other side of the pond, here we are in April of 1774, so just a few months later. This is the plan for establishing a new American post office, where I teach in my other role at Brown University. We actually have the original document here, which I think is pretty cool, because it's essentially the Declaration of Independence for information. It says, this is Goddard's printing, describing how the post office will work and how it will make sure that all of our letters are safe from the prying eyes of the British authorities. It says, you can't read it? Here it is. That the several mails shall be under lock and key and liable to the inspection of no person but the respective postmasters to whom directed, who shall be under oath for the faithful discharge of the trust imposed in them. Notice nothing about interception under the hand of the Secretary of State here. We've got an absolute guarantee of privacy laid out in the principles, at least, in Goddard's post office. Around this time of April, we start getting in American newspapers the news that Ben Franklin has been fired as deputy postmaster and that he has been shamefully abused at this hearing, and that Mr. Franklin is warning Americans of the possibility of interception under the hands of a warrant from the Secretary of State. All of these, by the way, were written by Franklin and published, as if they were, anonymously, but we know that Franklin actually wrote these alarms. And so it's very good news for William Goddard. Now, the one thing that people thought was a bad idea has gone away, and in fact, we have Franklin and Goddard kind of on the same side here. So moving forward a little bit faster, between kind of the summer of '74 and the outbreak of hostilities in April of 1775, we end up with a sort of strange period in 1775 when the war has started. Lexington and Concord, people have shot the shots that are heard around the world, and yet we don't know yet whether we're going to declare independence or not. So we have this strange situation in which Goddard's post offices are being widely used. His network is Constitutional Post, but we still have the Parliamentary Post being used as well. And then we start getting massive surveillance of all the letters by Patriot committees. Patriot committees are rummaging through the mail, especially the Parliamentary Post, to uncover the dastardly loyalists who might betray our revolution before it gets a chance to get going. One of those dastardly loyalists happens to be William Franklin. Governor Franklin of New Jersey, the person you've probably never heard of, very, very close to Ben Franklin, his father. The firstborn son of Ben Franklin, not legitimate, brought to the marriage of Ben Franklin and his wife, his long-suffering wife, we might say, presents her with a baby when he's first born. But this is the boy who's out there with the kite. He's the boy assisting his father. Ben Franklin dedicated his autobiography to William and then took it back. And it's because William Franklin decides to go with the king. How do we know that he went with the king? Well, his letters were intercepted. Here's the Journals of Congress, January 9th, 1776. Some dispatches from Governor Franklin, which were intercepted, were laid before the Congress and read. His letters were intercepted by a patriot by the name of William Alexander, who was styled himself the Lord of Stirling. The courts in Scotland did not agree, but he was still called Lord Stirling, which is ironic on many levels. He had seized these letters around the time that the parliamentary post went away completely. And so now Governor Franklin and other royal officials no longer had an official post office to send their dispatches that they could trust. He sent them via courier. The couriers were intercepted by a roving band of patriots who found these letters. The letters included a secret and confidential. It was like right on top of the letter. It said secret and confidential letter to Lord Dartmouth, the colonial secretary, giving detailed intelligence information about what was going on in America. William Franklin was by far the most important source for the intelligence service of Great Britain in this period. From 1775 to 76, had extraordinary political information about what was going on in the Continental Congress, had information about military activities. There's a great story, which I don't have time to go tell in full here, from January to July of 1776. Franklin is left alone to continue writing his letters because it's just too politically sensitive to arrest him being the son of Ben Franklin. And so despite these interceptions, he continues to serve as a loyal servant of the king at this time. He's imprisoned eventually, along with other loyalists. He arrives for to serve his imprisonment in exile. And I kid you not, the date he arrives in Connecticut to serve his imprisonment is July 4th, 1776. And it's not a coincidence. They needed to get rid of Franklin in order to get the votes that they needed in New Jersey to make the Declaration of Independence unanimous. Because Franklin is a powerful figure in New Jersey politics, and he has a lot of cards up his sleeve to try to keep New Jersey neutral and out of the war. But he is unsuccessful because of this surveillance operation, among other things. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about codes, ciphers, and invisible ink, since I promised that we talk about signal. These are the methods to keep things confidential when you have an unsecure channel, like, for example, all of the postal systems in colonial America, including the Constitutional Post. Everybody's reading them. Maybe you don't want Colonel Stirling to be sending you off to imprisonment if you're Governor Franklin, so why don't you use a code or a cipher? He didn't, by the way. He just wrote, this letter is for Mrs. Gage, who was the wife of General Gage in Massachusetts, and then if you opened it, you saw it was this confidential letter. So he could have done with some security. Well, I want to get a couple of key points here, do it quickly. A code substitutes a code name or a number for frequently used words. One example of that is a dictionary code. You put the number of the page, you put the number of the line, you put the number of where it appears in that line, and now you've got three numbers, and it gives you the word. And that can be done with a dictionary, it can be done with any common book. It's called a book code, often used in this time in the 18th century. And the code, the book, becomes the key. A cipher replaces letters in a plain text with a new alphabet to create a ciphertext. We'll get to different ways of doing ciphers. The simplest one is a monoalphabetic cipher, and it's also the least secure. And then invisible ink becomes a really important form of secret writing at this time because unlike these other two, it's somewhere you don't know that there's an invisible message. So if your letter is being searched, if you're being searched because you're going through some cordon and they see an innocuous pamphlet, an innocuous letter, then instead of seeing a bunch of numbers or letters where it's obvious there's a secret message, there's no, you conceal the existence of the message. Writing between the lines, that term is a literal fact when it comes to invisible ink, and that's where it comes from. You write a letter, and then between the lines of the letter, you write it in invisible ink, the true message. Here's the simplest cipher. I won't have enough time to really go through letting you figure it out, but this is the ciphertext. It should be trivially easy to figure this out. Here you've got the plain text, and here you've got the ciphertext. Shift the letters forward four places. So A becomes D, B becomes E, C becomes F. Incredibly easy. And of course, it stands for Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered, because this is the Caesar cipher. This is what Julius Caesar used to encipher his letters. An incredibly simple key, four places across. You could change the number of places, and that would give you added security. We have a much more complex cipher, but based on the same principle, by Blas de Vignières, a 16th century diplomat, which was considered unbreakable, and in fact was unbreakable until the 20th century. Multiple alphabets are used to frustrate the attack that you could use against one of these other ciphers. So some letters are more frequent than others. E, S, these are very frequent letters. T, the other letters being very, very infrequent. If you have a long enough message, a message of any length at all, you count up the number of letters, and then you can figure out which ones are likely to be the frequent letters and which ones are likely to be the infrequent letters. And through trial and error, you can decipher the letter. What Vignières does is he rotates through the alphabets so that you can't do that. You should use a long repeating key in order to do this. You shouldn't begin again at the beginning of words. The basic point I'm trying to make here is that there are basic techniques that you need to do to make these ciphers secure and useful. And they're unbroken for 3 centuries. So all of these techniques are available, as well as invisible ink, to the founders, and they start to use them. There are many problems with how encryption works at this time. First, you have to transmit your code books and your keys securely. Oftentimes, this was not done. So you'd have your diplomats over there in Paris. You'd have the Congress in Philadelphia. Nobody thought to actually create a cipher system. So now they're writing to each other, here's how we're going to set up our cipher system. Not very secure, right? If you want to change your key, now you have to somehow transmit that key. Today, we do that through Diffie-Hellman key exchange. But that wasn't invented until the 1970s. Known vulnerabilities, we already talked about frequency attack. Another one is common books might be used as keys. If you see the numbers, it's not too hard to guess, hey, there's a dictionary people are using for this. Or there's another common book that's being used for this. If you can do that very easily, you can break the message. Invisible ink, if you're not going to use lemon juice or milk, which is not particularly secure, every child knows this. In fact, Ben Franklin published a young boy's companion book that explained how you use invisible ink. So certainly something. But if you have more advanced types of invisible ink, you have to get chemicals that will work to encode and decode. And of course, people make mistakes. They smudge the invisible ink. They mess up how they do the cipher, and now the message is garbled and useless. I have this wonderful quote from Abigail Adams. Abigail and John Adams were famous for their marriage being a marriage that was an intellectual partnership sustained through long-distance correspondence because John and Abigail were often not living together in the same place. Abigail had a wonderful friend, John Lovell, who knew all about these ciphers and made it a hobby to figure them all out, and was continually trying to get people in the Continental Congress, including John Adams, to take more security when it came to their communications. And essentially, Abigail said, look, my husband is hopeless about this. I hate a cipher of any kind, she says, My friend, meaning her husband John, is no adept in investigating ciphers and hates to be puzzled for a meaning. And if you actually look at the primary sources, as I've done, what surprises me is not how much they're using codes and ciphers, but how little they are. There's little tiny passages in long, very, very confidential communications about military matters, about diplomatic secrets, and just a few lines might be encoded, or none at all. So you can just see that trying to use these ciphers was just too much most of the time for most of the founders. I'll do these a little quickly. Some interesting insider threat examples here. Dr. Benjamin Church, the first Surgeon General of the Continental Army, was a British spy. He was caught because of his enciphered letter that his mistress tried to carry to Newport, decoded by several aides to Washington. Of course, we're all familiar with Benedict Arnold. He used various forms of encrypted communication to try to communicate with his handlers. It was actually to arrange a meeting in order to finalize the deal that he didn't get caught. He escaped, but his handler John Andre got caught and hanged. So communication being a problem for both sides here. We've heard a lot about Washington spies. His famous spy ring in New York City called the Culper Ring. And what again, in investigating this, lots of great spy stories, lots of fun things to put on a historical TV show. You can watch it, Turn, on AMC. And of course, New York City is being occupied by the British through most of the war. Communications problems are really plaguing this whole effort from start to finish. It takes months for Washington to receive the intelligence because of the need to smuggle it out across the lines. And the concern, the understandable concern the spies have, they don't want to get caught and hanged like Nathan Hale was. And Washington is absolutely frustrated with this. Always trying, his efforts to get invisible ink, his efforts to do encoding were not primarily about the security of the message and more about trying to get the spies to send him the information quicker. And he never really got it as quickly as he wanted to. In one case, we had an agent die as a result of a communications lapse. And in fact, we have this interesting letter from Washington where he basically says this whole effort is not really worth it. It just wasn't worth the money. And really how we won the revolution was not over spying or gathering of intelligence information. We were hopeless at it. The British were 100 times better, 100 times better than the Americans. But when Washington figured out that he could use the British intelligence network against itself by making it appear that he was planning to attack New York City when he was actually going to go further south and ended up defeating the British at Yorktown. This is a fascinating period of where you show the brilliance of Washington really is not in spying or running a spy ring or gathering surveillance information. It's actually in recognizing that this might be a weakness of the other side. And this is not surprising when we remember that the British Empire was, after all, an empire. They had enormous resources, hundreds of thousands of pounds to devote to intelligence operations, while the Americans were futzing around trying to figure out how to do ciphers and invisible ink and mostly failing. Similar story from Jay, Franklin, and Adams in Paris negotiating the end of the Revolutionary War. This is, by the way, a fabulous painting of that moment, and you can see it's unfinished. Tells you a lot. It's unfinished because the British negotiators didn't want to sit for the painting. Edward Bancroft, secretary to the American delegation in Paris, was a British spy paid by the British with detailed intelligence requirements. He was never caught. He was only discovered 100 years later by historians looking in the British archives. So even if they had managed to do the encryption well, wouldn't have helped because Bancroft could have stolen the decrypted documents. Ben Franklin has this wonderful quote here. If I was sure that my valet de place was a spy, my valet de place was a spy, as he probably is, I think I should probably not discharge him for that if in other respects I liked him. In other words, I don't know who the spies are. I can't do anything about it. So I'm just going to live my life. And in fact, what Franklin does is he uses, again, the spy networks, not just of Britain, but also of France and Spain, feeding them information at strategic points so that they so that his strategy for achieving independence works out. In the 1780s, John Jay asks for and receives from the Articles of Confederation a sweeping power to inspect all letters in America as the Secretary of Foreign Affairs. And yet, this is to me, a mystery, because we have this power and we have this example of the British having had the power to engage in interception, and yet we don't end up with a permanent interception capability at this time. We don't end up with what is called a black chamber of surveillance, nothing like the NSA would become in the 20th century. So why? Well, a couple of key thoughts here, which gets us back to the law. We're all familiar with Article 2 of the Constitution, the executive power. And so we think, well, what is the executive power? That must include a power to spy. We look at Washington employing spies in New York, and we think, well, that makes sense. Article 2 is the power to spy. But there's more to the story than that. And I just want to tease the idea here. And that is, I haven't, still on the story of Article 2, John Jay, kind of reinforces that idea in the Federalist 64, where he talks about the president will be able to manage the business of intelligence in such a manner as prudence may direct. Jay was frustrated by all of the insecurity of the Continental Congress, and he wanted the president and a small group of senators to run this rather than the House of Representatives. People forget about the Senate, by the way, when they quote this. But what about the postal power? What about that? The Congress shall have power to establish post offices and post roads. Well, it turns out this is important for the issue of information independence. We talked about the constitutional post already, how important that was. And what we also see here is something also kind of, not obvious, but very important, and that is this power is a power that the framers are giving to Congress and not to the president. Remember, the original post was the royal mail, the king's post. It's a monarchical power. And they're saying, no, this is a power that should belong to the Congress. And why? Well, we'll get to that in a second. We also have to remember the amendments, right? Here's John Jay. Let us agree. We will have our Constitution and you will have our amendments, meaning the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, all of those rights that constrain both Congress and the president. And here's the final slide. So, we can get to questions, hopefully, at least a few. And kind of the conclusion of our story. In 1792, when we're talking about establishing the post office, the United States Postal Service we have today, again, we can trace it all the way back to William Goddard. We have Alexander White, we have James Madison, some big names here, and other Republican in the Congress, basically arguing that if you give too much power to the executive over the post office, that will put us on a path towards monarchy. An amendment has been proposed to delegate some of the postal powers from the Congress to the president. And they talk about how some of these might lead to the interception of letters and other kinds of infringements on rights by a lawless executive. This is in the debates over the Postal Act of 1792. As a result, we have no power of interception. There's no warrant to open mail. Which had existed before, by the way, in 1785 under John Jay during the Revolution. But we've taken it away here in 1792. In 1878, so much later, we get the Supreme Court in their very first interpretation of the Fourth Amendment. Ex parte Jackson, they interpret the Fourth Amendment to protect the mail. Interesting, concept here. We have a letter in the hands of the government, right, in a government service, and yet there's privacy that means you can't open it without a judicial warrant, not some kind of executive warrant. So these are all kind of, hints and pieces from the original understanding of the framers that, maybe imply that the president's power over interception and communications is not quite as big as it's been made out to be. With that, I'll say thank you very much and open to questions.
was great. Thank you so much, Tim. I'd love to get questions from the room. Maybe can you just talk briefly, and again, I think that last slide actually
Yeah.
sort of brought it home about sort of lessons, and I'm curious whether this story of the post office, as you're telling it, sort of my mind is going to all the analogies to
Yes.
digital technology. Does it get cited in
It does.
contemporary times as we think about regulation?
So it does, but then it falls away. And that's part of the, the longer story of my book is that when they first see the issues of wiretapping, they immediately make the connection to, well, this is the new post office. There's a constitutional issue here. We need to worry about privacy. We need to worry about the First Amendment. But then it kind of goes away with the idea that, we're really talking about issues around the Fourth Amendment. So that's where I think the analogy kind of, we end up losing that history. There's a wonderful editorial from the early 20th centuries when they're arguing against broad wiretapping, and the headline of the editorial is, "Why not tap the mail?" And the idea of tapping, the mail is, of course, anathema. Everybody knows you can't open a letter. It's been part of our history since the Revolution.
The other thing I'll say is, you tell the story through these great individuals, great men, Goddard and Franklin and Jay, and there's this tension there about giving power to the people, to Congress, versus giving power to these great individuals. How important is it that we had individuals who saw the value of these kinds of privacy protective regimes? It feels to me like it could have gone a very different way very quickly with the creation.
I have been struggling over this for a long time because it seems to me that it's actually a great mystery as to why there's no interception power. And I think the key here, the key moment, which I wasn't able to quite get into, is that during the debate over the Treaty of Paris, there was an intercept that the British tried to use with Jay to get him basically to distrust the French. And like most intercepts, it was much more effective because it was real, and actually there were reasons for him to distrust the French. That intercept, is transmitted by Jay to Congress. Congress gives in an uproar. Can we trust the French? And James Madison is part of the debate. And he has to kind of put things back together and say, no, 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 no. The French are our allies. The British are just trying to use these intercepts to divide us. And so I think that at least part of my working hypothesis is this is where, just the experience that they had with the interception going on in Europe kind of turned them off. There's like, we're building something different here in America. We don't want to be doing all this intrigue that they do over here in Europe. We want a different kind of society. And maybe they were a little naive in doing that, right? I mean, surveillance and interception is a part of any country's need to have security and to have intelligence. But they kind of wanted to turn their back on all that.
Time for a few questions.
When I was young, we had the Post Office Department, which was an executive cabinet department. Under, I believe, President Nixon, it was demoted out of the cabinet and became a sort of the semi-independent agency that wasn't under the direct control of the president anymore, which is why we still have until recently, we still had Louis DeJoy as the postmaster, even though Biden wouldn't have wanted him there. What constitutional issues had to be worked through to make that happen?
Well, I think probably we can imagine a number there in terms of like Humphrey's executor and stuff like that. But basically, it's an interesting point that the Postmaster General used to be a very important figure. I mean, he was a cabinet level official, one of the original cabinet level officials under Washington. And I think the goal here is not so much about the post office itself, is about the importance of the information network. Essentially, until you have the invention of wired communication in the mid-19th century, this is it. This is the whole game, right? So you're talking about the FCC, the Postmaster, the IETF, the Internet governance. It's all wrapped in this one individual. And yes, it was radically important, because it could be abused. And I think that's another reason why they didn't want an interception power. They didn't trust the Postmaster General with running an interception power because we might be out of power when this happens. And they certainly didn't trust the Secretary of State, who was Thomas Jefferson at the time. Nor should they have, by the way.
Great. Other questions from the room?
Hi, I was really intrigued by how some of the figures that you described kind of were blasé about privacy and didn't seem to be particularly concerned or seem to accept it as a fact of life. How did that sort of factor into early development or how we should think about some of the privacy protections they were putting out when they weren't necessarily seeking to use the privacy protections that were maybe in the letter of the law to their full extent?
I think it was an ideal that they were really striving for, but in the midst of war and revolution and hopelessness in dealing with cybersecurity. It's been, apparently cybersecurity has been a problem forever. They didn't have Signal. They did have Invisible Ink. They did have the Vignere cipher, but they couldn't they couldn't organize themselves to make that happen. So I really think it's more just a question of, human nature doesn't change, and we want to get our stuff done, and we sort of are willing to run a lot of risks that maybe we shouldn't be running, and they're no different than us in that respect.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk.
Yeah.
You spoke about the shifting legal landscape around intercepting the mails, both over time and on both sides of the Atlantic. Were there any significant legal regimes governing encryption, either around codebooks, sending encrypted mail, producers of invisible ink, or was it mostly all on the post side?
So it's a great question. There's a wonderful article that argues that encryption is one of the kind of unenumerated rights. There was never any effort to outlaw encryption. So the idea that the government had the right to somehow prevent you from, making sure that your communications was secure would be completely foreign to the founders. Maybe they would try to figure out how to decipher it, but the idea that they could sort of force you to decipher it for them was just not known. I mean, even Dr. Benjamin Church, the traitor that Washington discovered in his camp, he didn't put the thumb screws to Church to get him to decipher it. He had a group of people attack it, and after a couple of days, were able to uncover the unenciphered text. So I think it was just considered, part of, a fact of life that the mail was insecure. There were legal protections, but you never knew who might get a letter. It was not safe, and therefore, if you were intelligent and educated and literate, and you knew about classical, things like the Seaver cipher or more advanced things like the Vignere cipher, have at it. Do your best and try to make it work.
Great.
Oh, by the way, another fun fact: the inventor of the invisible ink used by Washington was Dr. James Jay, John Jay's brother.
A lot of brothers.
Lots of fun facts in this book, and that's part of my dilemma is how can I write this book and still keep it under the word limit that I have and not put in all the wonderful fun facts that I want to put in.
Obviously, volume 2 will have to follow.
There you go.
Tell your publisher.
The website.
Time for one more, if we have one. And if not, we're going to wrap this up, and Tim will be sticking around a little bit if you have other questions along the way. Thank you so much for being here. And
Thank you.
thanks to Tim for the
And I guess unofficially, this might be my first book talk. So there you
I'll
go.
have you back when it's done.
Yes, thank you. All right.